Today I want to talk you through the DSM criteria for autism diagnosis, which is used in the United States and parts of Europe. The DSM, or Diagnostic Statistical Manual, is kind of like the master textbook that psychologists use to diagnose people. It's developed by the American Psychiatric Association and it is very much focused on North America. But it is written in rather hard to understand language. So I wanted to take a look at it and break down all the different criteria that you need in order to get an autism diagnosis, so that it's a little bit more understandable for people who aren't psychologists. So here we go. For those of you who are new to my channel, I am Sam. I was recently diagnosed with autism as an adult and I now make videos about autism and neurodiversity right here on YouTube every single week. So if you think you might like that kind of thing, please stick around for more videos. So we're going to look at the DSM today, and although this is not used for diagnoses in every single country in the world, there are some alternatives, the main one being the ICD-11, which stands for International Classification of Diseases. But for the purposes of autism, the criteria in both of these manuals is kind of the same. The difference with the ICD is that, as you might have guessed from the name, it has been developed internationally. Now, I am not a registered psychologist. I did study psychology at university though, which helps, though not in a clinical setting, but I have also been through the diagnosis process with the DSM. So this video is kind of an attempt to get across what the heck it is all about and what it means with actual people and not theoretical examples. Bear in mind before I begin that both the DSM and the ICD very much see autism in the sort of disordered model. They both call it Autism Spectrum Disorder. And so they kind of operate on this deficit-based model where you have to have deficits in certain areas. This means that reading the report that they write about you afterwards makes you feel really tiny, small, and just pathetic. But the reality is, you can tick all the boxes necessary for a diagnosis, and that doesn't make you less than, it makes you a winner. So this kind of disorder model, which most people are familiar with, to be honest, is sort of what the neurodiversity movement is trying to counter. And this is why I believe that neurodiversity is empowering for all autistic people, not just the articulate and hyperverbal ones, but for all of us. So bear with me because the overuse of the word deficit makes me kind of twitch. Right, so let's start with category A. Persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, as manifested by the following, currently or by history. Examples are illustrative, not exhaustive, see text. Oh my god, these sentences, they're so much fun. So this whole category generally means you're bad at the social stuff. Not just at home, not just at school, not just in the workplace, not just at parties. It's a multi-system failure to social, in the way that is expected by society. So within category A, there are 3 different points, and you basically need to tick yes for all of these points in some way. So number 1, deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation to reduced sharing of interests, emotion, or affect, to failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. This is a very long-winded way of saying that you might be bad at interacting with people in a way that is expected by society. Social emotional reciprocity refers to the expected back and forth model of neurotypical social interaction. So a failure to do this could be something like you meet somebody for the first time and immediately launch into a monologue about yourself or about one of your interests. You might not understand the rules of small talk and make sort of constant faux pas. You might answer things very literally, or perhaps with one-word answers that kind of stop the conversation. The back and forth doesn't happen quite as fluently. And so for me, although I mask a lot, although I mask less than I used to now, I think, apparently in childhood, I just never shared my feelings when something was wrong, when I had a bad day, for example. So the emotional reciprocity, that wasn't fluent. Somebody told me, oh, I've had a really bad day, and I didn't give them anything in response to that. Especially if somebody said that they were sad in some way, and I didn't know how to reply to that. I didn't know what to say, what was expected of me. So some conversations can be difficult, and I'm not saying that I can't have a conversation. I think that this is a skill that I have learned, but even as an adult I do struggle to maintain conversations, especially ones that are built around social protocol like small talk rather than being in-depth with somebody. So point number 2 that you also have to have, that also counts under category A, is deficits in non-verbal communicative behaviours used for social interaction, ranging, for example, from poorly integrated verbal and non-verbal communication to abnormalities in eye contact and body language, or deficits in understanding and use of gestures, to a total lack of facial expressions and non-verbal communication. And this one is a little bit easier to understand conceptually, but it is nestled in such a long sentence, so I understand if you zoned out for a bit there, because I kind of did too while I was filming. So here we're talking body language and facial expressions. So you might not like eye contact, you might not do it at all, or you might kind of try to do it but use it wrong, or you might just get very anxious about the whole concept of why you should be making eye contact. You may not make facial expressions as expected, whether that is too much or not at all. When I was younger especially, I found it very hard for me to control my facial expressions when something really bad happened. So if I'd heard of somebody's death, I would smile, or if I was telling somebody about somebody's death, I would smile. I remember going to tell my best friend that Princess Diana had died, and I was smiling, and she thought, well, she was a bit confused. She thought I was joking, but it was just kind of a thing that I did, and I don't know why I did it. You might also not be able to mimic or read other people's body language very well, and so you can't really tell what their mood is from their non-verbal tells, as it were. So that's really what number 2 is about. It's about non-verbal communication. And you might be able to do it to some extent, but the point is that it's an atypical expression of it. So moving on to number 3, which is deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, ranging, for example, from difficulties adjusting behaviour to suit various social contexts, to difficulties in sharing imaginative play or in making friends, to absence of interest in peers. And what this really means is that by the time you get to adulthood especially, it's just really hard for you to make and keep friends, even if you try, even if you want the friends. Obviously, if you ticked yes to numbers 1 and 2, it kind of follows on that number 3 will be a yes as well, because if you struggle to communicate verbally and non-verbally with the neurotypical majority, the chances are that it is harder for you to make friends. It's kind of a logical consequence. So obviously I was asked about friends during my assessment, and it was something like, what does friendship mean to you? Or what does it mean to be a friend? Every time I press record, there's children outside screaming. So I was actually asked about friendships during my assessment, and something like, what does being a friend, what does that mean to you? What does friendship mean to you? And I found that so hard to answer. And I have friends, I have had friends in the past, but it's always been a lot of work for me to maintain the friendship and really be sure that this person is a real friend and not just saying that they're a friend because they're trying to manipulate me in some way. And I think when I was younger, definitely, I had a much more naive outlook on friendship and kind of believed that you made friends and then you all just remained friends forever and hung around in the same friendship group forever, just like you saw on TV. But this is my particular presentation of how I kind of make friends. Often autistic people don't play typically, although I dispute that autistic play doesn't involve imagination, because I think it does. But the sort of atypical play, rather than playing in the way that you would expect other children to do, autistic children might play off to the side, or a lot of autistic girls do, I can't remember what the word is, it's something like butterflying, flittering or something like that, where they kind of go from group to group, so it looks like they are in the party, but they're actually observing from the outside. Right, so 1, 2 and 3 all need to count for a diagnosis, but you don't have to fit in with every example that they give, because some of them are contradictory to each other. Moving on to category B, which I find a little bit more confusing, and that is restricted, repetitive patterns of behaviour, interests or activities as manifested by at least 2 of the following, currently or by history. Examples are illustrative, not exhaustive, see text. So basically you only need 2 out of 4 in this next section. I'm an overachiever, so I think I got 3. Let's start with number 1. Stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech, e.g. simple motor stereotypes, lining up toys or flipping objects, echolalia, idiosyncratic phrases. So what we're talking about here is stimming, which is kind of short for self-stimulatory behaviour. Whether it's stimming with your hands, flapping your hands, repetitive movements like this, vocally stimming, such as making animal noises or something. A lot of autistic people do a lot of meowing, or copying other people's phrases, or copying things that you just said, which is called echolalia. So that could be a phrase, a noise, or a sound. Sometimes these noises can be quite annoying. Number 2, insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines or ritualized patterns of verbal or non-verbal behavior, e.g. extreme distress at small changes, difficulties with transitions, rigid thinking patterns, greeting rituals, need to take same route or eat same food every day. So this is the one that I didn't relate to as much. I'm quite a flexible person in some ways, but I'm not really stuck on sameness in the way that some autistic people can be. But that's okay, because you only need 2 out of 4 in this category. So this is just my presentation of how autism is. And there are many autistic people that do suffer distress when you make small changes in their routine, and that's just as valid as my autism. But I do relate to it somewhat, especially when I was younger. I was a little bit more rigid, I think, especially when it comes to food. I would only eat food a certain way. And so this sort of need for sameness often makes autistic people appear controlling or even manipulative, which they're not being, because it's an anxiety response. They need to have things that way. And this isn't about controlling other people, this is about their own experience. And it doesn't always follow that you change something slightly and that equals a big meltdown. That's not how autistic people work. There are autistic people who could melt down at small changes in their lives, but it's usually not just that one thing. It's usually a build-up over several days or maybe over several weeks or even months. So when you think of a transition that they mentioned, difficulty with transitions, this could be as simple as going from doing your homework to going to have dinner, a transition in your day-to-day life. But it could be something more significant, like finishing senior school and going to university. That's a significant life transition. And that's hard for everybody, but for autistic people it can be especially hard. Actually, I did do a video on my experiences at university which kind of go into the fact that I found it a really difficult transition to do, so do check that one out if you're interested. Moving on to number 3, which is highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. E.g. strong attachment to or preoccupation with unusual objects, excessively circumscribed or perseverative interests. They really had to work hard to make special interests seem quite so disordered, I think. This is what they're talking about. They're talking about autistic special interests. The thing about this one is that it seems like there is a particular focus on how normal or appropriate the interest is. And I find this extremely distasteful that it is written up like that a special interest that brings someone joy can be so pathologized. But here it is. This is what they mean by that. If you get any autistic person to finish the sentence, when I was X years old, let's say, when I was 10 years old, I was obsessed with, and see what comes up, because it is such a broad spectrum, and we're not all just interested in machines or objects. We can have a special interest about anything, and believe us, then once you get us going, it's hard to get us to stop. But I like to think that's part of my charm. Some people carry on with these very intense interests their whole lives, and that's just their thing. And some people have shorter, intense interests which they then move on from and get bored. And that's kind of where I sit. I've been through so many really intense interests, some of which I kind of carried on and some of which I dropped. So it's basically like a very intense version of going through a phase. So for me, my special interests in chronological order have been gymnastics, the Spice Girls, the TV show Friends, the TV show Buffy, psychology, atheism and religion, gluten-free food, nutrition and the ketogenic diet. Then once I became a parent, it moved on to childhood development and parenting, YouTube, analytics and SEO, and of course, autism. And none of these things are, in my opinion, pathological to be interested in. It's not a problem that I'm interested in these things, and honestly, it's not been a problem that I've been really obsessed with them, and I'll use that word obsessed. I was obsessed with Friends, but do you know what that obsession helped me do? That obsession helped me learn to code HTML because I wanted to do a Friends fan site. It connected me with people from around the world. I ended up having some of my scrapbook Friends art being sent to, I think, Courtney Cox on their last day of filming. So special interests open the world to autistic people, and it's problematic that it's pathologized. But there you go. And when you're in this love affair with your special interest, it's all you want to look at, research, read about, talk about. It's like being in love with a topic. Moving on to the last one in category B, which is number 4, hyper or hypo-reactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. E.g. apparent indifference to pain and temperature, adverse response to specific sounds or textures, excessive smelling or touching of objects, visual fascination with lights or movement. This is quite self-explanatory. This is about sensory issues. And as a hypersensitive autistic person, I always have to remind myself not to forget about the hyposensitive autistics out there. So basically we are kind of like at the extremes. And this is why autism is a neurological condition and not a behavioral or psychological one. It seems the actual way our brains are physically wired is different from neurotypicals. And this starts with the very basics, how we sense the world, how we sense our surroundings. I have noise sensitivity that gets much worse during times of stress, but I'm also a visual seeker, so I really enjoy visual stimuli, you know, like glittery things, sparkly things, oozy things, good oozy things, not bad oozy things. I also don't like being touched by strangers. I don't really like being touched by surprise. Like if somebody sneaks up and gives me a hug, I'll probably scream. But I really like deep pressure such as massage or big squeezy hugs or weighted blankets. So that was point number 4, and you need 2 out of these 4 that I've just mentioned to continue to get your diagnosis. Moving on to category C now, which is symptoms must be present in the early developmental period but may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities or may be masked by learned strategies in later life. Basically, this means that this isn't something that just you acquired, because you can acquire symptoms that are similar to autism through a traumatic brain injury, for example. But this basically means that you've always been like this and you were like this as a child. And it's very difficult to tease it out, especially if there has been childhood trauma or abuse. But that is what a good diagnostician is there for. If that's not the case, then it should be reasonably self-explanatory, at least for yourself, as to whether you've always been like this. But this is a very crucial point because it mentions masking specifically, and also hints at the fact that maybe if you had a really nice, stress-free childhood, you might not necessarily show any issues until demand exceeds capacity. And for me, even though looking back now I can definitely see my autistic traits in childhood, they didn't cause me a problem until I would say puberty. And that was when the social stuff got more confusing, I had a larger workload, so my executive function issues were more noticeable. And then things kind of like, I would say, progressively got worse throughout my 20s and early 30s. So that's category C. It needs to have been there since your childhood. Right, so we're on to category D, which is my least favourite of the categories, and you will soon see why. Symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. So this is really the one that I think needs rethinking the most. You could agree with every single autistic trait or symptom or whatever, but because it doesn't cause distress, that means you're not autistic? That just doesn't seem very likely. The thing that's hard is living in a world that's not set up for you. Let's say that you grew up in a family that accommodated your needs without really knowing that that's what they were doing. Maybe you found a job in a very autism-friendly industry or company. You had a few friends who happened to also be autistic. So maybe it never gets to the point of distress. You have a simple life, you have a stress-free life, but that still makes you autistic. And I would say that the more stress that you put on autistic people, the more obvious our traits can be. I understand why they put this in there, because their reasoning is, if all these happy little autists got diagnosed, first of all, it would be an epidemic, it'd be an autism epidemic. But the system would be overrun, they'd have to support all these autistic people. So maybe we should save the diagnoses for those who really need them. I don't agree with this, because you can be functioning fine at a point in your life. You relate to all the autistic traits and they say, yeah, but it's not really causing you any problems. Maybe 10 years down the line, it does start to cause you problems. You're no more autistic than you were 10 years ago. But for most, many, a lot of, not sure exactly the numbers, but for some autistic people, especially if you were not diagnosed in childhood, when you were diagnosed as an adult, you're usually diagnosed because of a breaking point. And this could be a period of depression, a period of anxiety, losing friends or a partner, losing your job, or struggling to find employment, and even a full-blown autistic burnout. And all of these things do count as clinically significant. So don't think that just because you haven't had a meltdown in public or you haven't done this, that you don't have clinically significant signs of autism. Because if it's causing you suffering in your everyday life, you need to get that across to the diagnostician. But I think it's a problem that we won't diagnose a neurotype on the basis of, well, you're not suffering now, are you? So the final category is category E, and this is that these disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability or intellectual development disorder or global developmental delay. Intellectual disability and autism spectrum disorder frequently co-occur. To make comorbid diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability, social communication should be below that expected for general developmental level. That's a very complicated sentence as well. But basically, before they diagnose you with autism, they want to exclude a more general delay that isn't specific to autism. Because it used to be the case that autism was lumped together with intellectual disability, which I think is where a lot of the stereotypes come from. But they now have to rule these things out, and in my assessment, they also ruled out other things like personality disorders, psychosis, and that kind of thing. But you know, reading this whole thing is kind of making me feel bad about myself. I've tried really hard to be confident and proud of being autistic. And this is, I think, what happens when the medical and deficit-based model of autism is the sort of prominent one. Because this is about box ticking, this is about identifying a disorder, about using normal behavior as a benchmark for identifying abnormal behavior. Because you can't have abnormal unless you have an idea of what normal behavior is. But although all of these points can be misinterpreted by clinicians who don't maybe have a good idea of how autism can present in adults or in women, I do think that they make sense in a lot of ways, and I identify with them, and that's how I got a diagnosis. It's just about knowing what they actually mean when they say stereotypes or repetitive behaviours. What does that mean? That's a weird thing that doesn't have much meaning. But if you say, do you constantly bite your nails? Do you constantly fidget? Are you pulling your hair like this? I'm sure then people would give a lot more examples. So there's a definite barrier in terms of the language that they use. And I think the other big problem with this, and this isn't just for the DSM, but this is the process in general, is that a lot of it is through interviews and self-reporting. And if you are asked, do you do something normally or do you do something unusually, maybe you and your whole family think that you're normal because that's how things have always been for you and that's normal for you. So it's very difficult to know whether something you experience is actually how everybody else experiences things. Even though I think that we know our own experience, the difficulty comes in trying to compare that to what other people's experience are like. Because autistic or neurotypical, nobody actually knows what anyone else is feeling on the inside. And if you come from a family of autistic people, how on earth are you supposed to know what neurotypical people are like? And the thing that really bugs me about this disorder deficit model is that there is no room for autistic joy. And by that I mean it's strange that special interests are so pathologized when they're some of the things that bring us the most joy and most value out of life. And I think it's pretty awful that that is treated as though it's a deficit, when the truth is autistic perseverance and special interests have pushed technology and the world to new limits. So I hope that I've explained it in a way that makes you get what it's saying. I have broader criticisms of the diagnosis process in general. It's imperfect. I think it will always be a flawed process until we can do a brain scan and diagnose autism like that. If you are pre-diagnosis or in the diagnosis process, please check out my other video here on whether or not it is worth getting an autism diagnosis in adulthood. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time. Bye.